In May of 2026, the United States government did something it had never done before. It opened a public website, gave it no clearance requirements, and began uploading military records on unidentified aerial phenomena directly to the internet. No FOIA request needed. No congressional subpoena. Just files, dropped in batches, available to anyone with a browser. The program is called Pursue, the Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP encounters, and it now holds more than 200 records, with new material added every few weeks. The first batch went up on May 8th. The second followed 2 weeks later, on May 22nd. A third arrived on June 12th. By the time the dust settled on those 3 releases, the public archive included documents from the FBI, NASA, the CIA, the State Department, the Department of Energy, and the Pentagon itself, dating as far back as the 1940s. Within days, the site had logged more than 1 billion visits. Most of what's in there is what you'd expect: grainy infrared footage, distant lights, objects too small and too far away to draw any real conclusion from. The Pentagon's own analysts have been upfront about that limitation, noting that the imagery in many of these files is consistently lower resolution than the sensor systems that produced them should have been capable of recording. But scattered through the releases are a handful of cases that are different. Cases with named ranks, specific altitudes, exact dates, and official document numbers. Cases written not by hobbyists or anonymous tipsters, but by people whose job it is to know what they're looking at: intelligence officers, fighter pilots, submarine crews, military operators filing reports through the same chain of command they'd use to report anything else. In this video, we're going to look at 5 of those cases. 5 documented encounters, reported by military pilots and personnel, now sitting on a United States government server for anyone to read. Case 1. The Senior Intelligence Officer's Helicopter. In late 2025, a currently serving senior official in the U.S. intelligence community filed a written account that would later become the centerpiece of the second Pursue release, published on May 22nd, 2026, and cataloged as ODNI UAP Die Zonenonwerte 1. The officer was not investigating UFOs that night. He was investigating noise. Crews on a restricted military test range had reported hearing loud thuds coming from the surrounding mountains, and those reports happened to coincide with several nights of UAP sightings in the same area. So the officer, along with a colleague and 2 pilots, took off from their Joint Operations Center in a helicopter to search the terrain for debris, anything that might explain the sound. For the first stretch of the flight, what they found was mundane: wreckage from old rocket and weapons testing, scattered across a range that had been used for that purpose for years. Then a ground team on the range reported something on their forward-looking infrared sensor, an object described as extremely hot, moving low and fast, first east, then turning south. The object split into 2. The helicopter crew, scanning with night vision, thermal imaging, and the naked eye, were told over radio that the object had risen up from the ground, closed to within 10 feet of the aircraft, dropped below it, and then accelerated away. They tried to follow. They couldn't keep up. What happened next is the part of the file that has drawn the most attention. Directed by radar contacts from the operations center, the crew took up a hover at roughly 700 feet. Through night vision and unaided eyesight, they watched 2 large orbs flare into view side by side, close to the helicopter, hanging stationary just above the rotor disc. The officer described them as oval, orange, with a white or yellow center, casting light in every direction. A third orb flared beneath the pair, then a fourth beneath that, forming a loose T-shape under the original 2. After 10 to 15 seconds, they dimmed in the same order they'd appeared and vanished. The officer wrote that he didn't photograph any of it because his attention was on figuring out what he was looking at and whether it posed a threat to the aircraft. Later in the same mission, fighter jets were brought in to assist, and according to the account, The same kind of orbs reappeared above the responding aircraft, matching their speed and flight path before dimming out again. The line from the file that's now been quoted across dozens of outlets is the officer's own closing description of the crew's reaction. "We were virtually speechless after these observations." The document offers no conclusion about what the orbs were. It's a first-person operational narrative, filed for the internal record, now public for the first time. Analysts who've gone through the broader May 22nd release have pointed out what makes this particular file stand apart from most of what else came out that day. It isn't a 30-second infrared clip with no context attached. It's 2 full pages, written by a named rank rather than an anonymous source, describing an event witnessed through 4 separate channels at once: radar direction from the operations center, forward-looking infrared from the ground team, night vision from the aircrew, and the unaided eye. It also isn't a single observer's account. There were at least 6 people involved across the helicopter, the ground team, and the fighter crews who were brought in midway through. The officer notes in his closing lines that he filed a formal debrief that same night, before driving home. The kind of procedural detail that doesn't usually appear in accounts written for public consumption, because it wasn't written for public consumption. It was written as an internal record, years before anyone outside a small circle was ever expected to read it. Case 2. The F-16 that fired on an unidentified object. Most people who followed the news in February of 2023 remember the wave of objects shot down over North America that month. A Chinese surveillance balloon off South Carolina. Then, in 3 consecutive days, 3 more objects brought down over Alaska, Canada's Yukon, and finally Lake Huron, on the US-Canada border near Michigan. At the time, officials described the Lake Huron object only in vague terms: octagonal in shape, with strings hanging from it, no visible payload, flying at around 20,000 feet. For 3 years, the Pentagon released no footage of the engagement itself. That changed on May 22, 2026, when the second Pursue batch included the actual infrared cockpit recording from the F-16C that fired the shot, an Air National Guard aircraft out of the 148th Fighter Wing using an AIM-9X missile. The clip runs under a minute. It shows the object centered in the targeting reticle, a brief flash, and then the shape breaking apart into pieces that drift and tumble out of frame. The Pentagon's own description, attached to the file, states plainly that several members of Congress requested access to this material back in March of 2026, and that the analysts who reviewed it noted the chain of custody on some of these records could not be fully substantiated before they reached the classified network where they were found. What makes this case worth including isn't mystery. It's the gap between what was said in the moment and what the footage actually shows. The unclassified cockpit audio from the 2 F-16 pilots involved, published independently the day after the original 2023 incident, captured one of them saying he wouldn't really call it a balloon, that he could see something with his own eyes that looked distended, hard to identify. That description doesn't obviously match a weather balloon. The former head of the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office has said publicly and repeatedly that he believes all 3 of February 2023's objects were almost certainly balloons, based on their radar signatures, drift patterns, and post-impact thermal readings. The newly released footage hasn't settled the disagreement. It's simply given the public, for the first time, the actual moment of impact to judge for themselves 3 years after the fact. It's also worth remembering how that week unfolded in real time. The Lake Huron object was the 4th shoot-down in 8 days after the original Chinese surveillance balloon was downed off South Carolina by an F-22, followed by separate engagements off Alaska and over Canada's Yukon territory. The commanding general overseeing North American airspace at the time was asked directly whether more objects might still be up there, and said only that it was certainly possible, without confirming anything further. NORAD radar had been tracking the Lake Huron object for hours before the intercept, and none of the wreckage from any of the 3 follow-on shoot-downs was ever recovered. The Pentagon's own write-up accompanying the newly released clip notes something else worth sitting with. Across nearly all 51 videos in that same batch, the footage is consistently low resolution, despite coming from sensor systems that, in 2023, were capable of producing far sharper imagery. Whether that's a function of compression, classification handling, or simply which cameras happen to be running, the file doesn't say. Case 3. The orbs around the submarine. Buried in that same May 22nd release, with far less fanfare than the helicopter account or the Lake Huron footage, is a video dated March 25, 2022. No location is given in the file. What it shows is a surfaced U.S. Navy submarine, and around it, multiple small spherical objects moving in and out of the water. Some appear to hover briefly at the surface before submerging again. Observers who reviewed the clip when it surfaced online noted that the objects change direction independently of one another, in ways that don't match how a cluster of balloons or debris would behave in wind or current. A balloon doesn't reverse course and dive into the ocean. 2 separate file identifiers in the Pursue catalog, both stamped with the same March 2022 date, appear to reference the same footage from slightly different angles or sensor passes. This is one of the cases where the official documentation says almost nothing. No altitude estimate, no speed. No named witness statement attached to the video itself, just a clip and a date. In the Pursue catalog, the footage actually appears under 2 separate file numbers, logged from what look like 2 different sensor angles or passes of the same encounter, both stamped with the identical date in March of 2022. What gives the case its weight is the broader context the Navy has put on the record in unrelated congressional testimony over the past several years. That the service tracks unidentified objects operating near its vessels with some regularity, and that a number of these incidents involve what officials have called trans-medium behavior, objects that appear to move between air and water without losing speed or changing how they're built to handle either environment. The term researchers in this field use for objects specifically tied to water is USO, Unidentified Submerged Object, a category that goes back decades in naval reporting, but has rarely come with footage this direct. Engineering a vehicle that does that, openly, with no visible propulsion signature, is not something any publicly known military program, American or otherwise, has demonstrated. Which leaves the file exactly where the Pentagon's own disclaimer says every entry in this archive sits, a description of what was observed, not a determination of what it was. Case 4. The triangular metallic object over the Mediterranean. This is the oldest of the 5 cases by file date, first surfacing in the very first Pursue release on May 8, 2026, and then referenced again as the second release went out 2 weeks later. A pilot, flying over the Mediterranean near Greek airspace in 2023, filed a report describing a single object as triangular and metallic. The numbers in the official record are specific, almost to the point of looking like a typo. An altitude of 24,989 feet, a speed of 168 knots, which converts to a little under 193 miles per hour. Slow for a military jet. Slow enough that whatever it wasn't trying to outrun anything. What stands out about this file isn't the sighting itself. Triangular UAP reports go back decades and form one of the more common shapes in the broader literature. It's the disclaimer the Pentagon attached directly to the document. The released file states explicitly that all descriptive and estimative language in the report reflects the subjective interpretation of the person who filed it at the time of the event, and that none of it should be read as a conclusive statement about whether the object had any particular physical characteristics at all. In plain terms, the government is publishing the pilot's account, but is going out of its way, in writing, to avoid confirming a single detail of it, including the very words triangular and metallic. That's a notable thing for an official agency to put its name on. That same disclaimer language, almost word for word, shows up attached to dozens of other entries scattered across all 3 Pursue releases, which suggests it isn't case-specific caution so much as a blanket legal posture the department has adopted for the entire program, a way of releasing the raw material without ever putting the government's name behind any single interpretation of it. It means the file exists in the record not because anyone has verified what was seen, but because the report itself, filed by a credentialed military pilot through proper channels, met the bar for declassification and release. The shape, the altitude, the speed, all of it comes from one person's eyes, in one moment, over open water. Case 5, 209 sightings near one installation. Among the document releases is a 116-page file concerning a sensitive U.S. military facility, drawing on a cluster of incidents that runs from the late 1940s up through more recent reporting tied to the same location. The Pentagon's own summary states that the archive includes 209 separate reports of green orbs, disks, and fireballs in proximity to the installation, along with multiple accounts of objects maneuvering, vanishing from sight, or appearing to explode midair. Some of the earliest material in the file connects to Project Grudge, a short-lived Air Force program from 1949 that was one of the first formal government attempts to evaluate UFO sightings during the opening years of the Cold War. The earliest wave of reports clusters tightly around 1948 to 1950, with witnesses describing the green fireballs as moving in patterns that didn't match meteors, sometimes in apparent formation, sometimes low and slow over the facility itself, rather than the high, brief streak you'd expect from something burning up in the atmosphere. Investigators at the time looked into traces of residual copper powder found at several of the sighting locations, without ever reaching a public conclusion about its source. The Pentagon's current assessment, attached to the file, is direct about where the uncertainty lies: the all-domain anomaly. Resolution Office states that a large share of these 209 reports can likely be explained by conventional causes, weather balloons, drone activity, or artifacts produced by the sensors used to record them. But the same assessment carves out an exception. A subset of the reports, including incidents where multiple objects were seen moving in coordinated formation, and others involving sudden, sharp acceleration, doesn't fit cleanly into any of those categories. The file doesn't say how large that subset is. It also doesn't pretend the unexplained cases are evidence of anything beyond what's written. Visual reports, recorded across roughly 8 decades, near the same patch of restricted airspace, that nobody, then or now, has been able to fully resolve. So what do you do with 5 cases like this? A first-person account from a sitting intelligence officer, a missile engagement caught on camera, a submarine shadowed by something that moves through water like it isn't water at all, a pilot's triangle that the Pentagon won't confirm or deny in its own paperwork, and 80 years of green fireballs over one piece of land that the government has never been able to fully explain away. Individually, each of these has a door left open to a conventional answer. Balloons drift, sensors glitch, tired pilots misjudge distance and shape at altitude. Officials who've reviewed this material on the record have said as much, sometimes about the very files they were responsible for releasing. What's harder to wave off is the pattern sitting underneath all 5. Every one of these cases comes from someone with a professional reputation tied to the report, filed through an official channel under their own name or rank, not posted anonymously to a forum. Every file carries the same built-in caveat from the agency releasing it, that the language used is the witness's own interpretation, not a government finding. And every case, examined closely, ends the same way the last one began, with a precise detail, an altitude, a timestamp, a missile shot, a date stamped on a submarine video that the people who recorded it were never able to fully account for. There's also the matter of timing. None of these 5 reports are new. The helicopter encounter happened in 2025. The Lake Huron shootdown happened in 2023. The submarine video dates to 2022. The triangular object over the Mediterranean was filed in 2023. The fireball reports near the military installation stretch back to 1948. What changed in 2026 wasn't the underlying event. It was the decision to put all of it on a public server, under a presidential order, with the Pentagon's own name attached. That's a different kind of disclosure than a leaked video or a whistleblower's testimony. It's an institution choosing, for whatever reason, to stop sitting on material it has held for years, and in some cases, for decades. The files are public now. The cases are documented. What isn't there in any of the 5 is an ending.